Happy fall.
I love fall. It's my favorite season. It's actually one of the reasons I was really excited to move back to the Midwest because Florida doesn't have fall. It's just not a thing there. Like some of the trees change colors, but it's not pretty.
No.
It's
Yeah.
ugly. And it's
Yeah.
still fucking hot.
It's still no, LA fall is so hot and it has a little bit of leaves. And my husband is obsessed with fall. Our entire apartment is head to toe decorated for Halloween. And I like held him off. I was like, you have to wait till it's September.
August 1st, he's like, let me at them. Let me
Yeah,
at those decorations.
because he knows. So July 1st is when they start putting fall toys or not like
Yeah.
decor and stuff in the store, and he knows. I gave him a
Mm-hmm.
happy first day of fall card on July 1st.
Aw.
But yeah, it's he loves fall, but I'm like, you haven't seen Midwest fall or Boston fall. That was
Oh, New
beautiful.
England falls so nice. Although I have had people try to argue with me that like, it's much nicer in New England. I'm like, I don't know. Like Northeast Ohio and like northwestern Pennsylvania has really beautiful scenery. Like
Oh yeah,
Midwest,
Upper
I don't know.
Peninsula of Michigan. You're
Yeah.
in Narnia. You're like, I'm in
Yeah.
Narnia right now.
Speaking of Narnia, that's a fairy tale myth
That's a
thing. It's a
fantasy.
fantasy.
It's a fantasy. Is
Is it
it
my
your
fantasy?
fantasy?
Well, we're gonna have to wait till we get to that episode. Welcome to Not My Fantasy.
Yeah, welcome to the first episode of Not My Fantasy. I'm Cullen.
And I'm Hannah.
You may have first discovered us on our almost currently still running, but almost over podcast Glee Boot, where we permanently damaged our brains by both consuming a lot of alcohol and rewatching Ryan Murphy's Glee.
Disney's Ryan Murphy's Glee.
Glee. You know what? Yeah, we survived the Glee interregnum in between Glee being on Netflix and Disney Plus.
Yeah, I love that you were like, yeah, when we let our guests use an account to watch these movies with us, they're gonna be really concerned as to why we own the worst season of Glee on that account.
Yep, season 5, baby. So I mean, we've been having a lot of fun with Glee, but I was like thinking of all the hours of my life devoted to that television show, and I'm like, why that? And
Is that productive?
that productive. I think it is. I think it ultimately is productive, but I have other passions and interests, and one of them is like folklore, fantasy, fairy tales, like the evolution of myth, religion, history, like how it all intersects. And a great way that I can talk about that with people is through movies, because that's how most of us are exposed to those stories and concepts,
Mhm.
through either books, but more often the movie adaptations. And we'll get into this podcast how, because it's Hollywood, that means the stories of the genre that people are exposed to the most are white Western European. um
Although there's a bit of a shift over the past 5-ish years to
yeah,
include other cultures more than just like Mulan.
yeah, and like Aladdin, which we'll get into the history of that story.
Oh
But like,
boy.
it's like inching. It's like, okay, we can have black elves and mermaids, and people like are freaking out. And I do wonder though how much of that is like equivalent to like the Starbucks Christmas cup.
Mm-hmm. The
You
Warren
know,
Christmas, aka the Warren culture, the Warren white culture.
so like we'll eventually we will talk about some Christmas property, and we'll have to talk about that. Let me just say, I find discourse on both perspectives really ignoring the major issues, and just on a lovely sheen over how they want to do their capitalism. But so Not My Fantasy, we're kind of will be watching fairy tale and fantasy movies, and we'll be talking about the source material, breaking it down, breaking the movies down based on like their story choices, their adaptational choices. And I think we want to, like, we love talking about things we love and roasting things that we don't like, but I think we want to approach this in like good faith, and not just like one of those like YouTube videos where they like count every error in a movie. Like, we're not here to talk about
We're not CinemaSins.
Yeah, we're not CinemaSins. Like, we're not going to talk about the historical accuracy of the 1989 Little Mermaid movie, because historically accurate to what? You know, so, but we will talk about like Hans Christian Andersen and his story in the context of that story, and how Howard Ashman influenced the Disney version. You know, like there's a lot to talk about in cultural context, which is different from just blatant historical accuracy, which no piece of media will ever achieve
Right.
while being watchable.
Yeah, because like history isn't very like fun to watch unless there's some little like spice added to it. Like,
yeah, like you can arrange it. And
history is slice of life until it's studied.
Yeah, you can make a narrative with history, but even your history books, when they tell a story, they're making a narrative. You have to choose what elements to include and not include. And oh boy, we've been delving deep in the first few minutes. But that's,
this is what you can expect.
This is what you can expect from us. We're both Midwesterners.
In case you couldn't tell by our accents. Our accents.
We met in Boston. We studied screenwriting at Boston University.
Mm-hmm.
We will be talking about which characters have the strongest desire in these
scripts.
We
will be breaking down protagonists, plot, scenes,
so some lingo,
sets, which I mean isn't really anything we studied necessarily. World building. Sets. That's what we studied. Yeah.
So shout out to BU. You never sent me my diploma, but I still get all the phone calls asking for money.
I can't believe you still don't have your diploma.
I know, what? And I requested a copy. I was like, yeah, I'll pay the $50, and I put in the comments, yeah, you never sent this to me, and I still haven't heard anything. And I'm like, did I not graduate? You're not telling me? Like,
damn,
yeah,
brutal. So you should just reach out to one of our teachers, be like, hey, can we get this expedited? Because I haven't gotten it yet, and I just want to make sure like my degree is legit.
Yeah. So yeah, I had a passion about these kind of stories from a young age. Growing up, I loved Disney movies and the Chronicles of Narnia and the Wizard of Oz. And I remember my mom started, like, I was trying to get some Disney books from the library, and she was like, you should read the original. Like, let's get you the Brothers Grimm. And we can talk about how there's no such thing as an original folktale or fairy tale because they come from oral history.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you can point at pinpoints where it was written down by a certain person and culture, but it's not like some stories. We'll get the Little Mermaid. That's a literary story, like a one dude like wrote it. But a lot of these, it's just one person's version of a story that's told in multiple times and cultures.
Yeah.
So any YouTube video telling you about the original story behind some Disney movie is poorly researched.
Yeah, or oversimplified.
Yeah.
I frankly, I don't really know shit about folklore, fairy tales, mythology. I am someone who, honestly, I was so focused on watching Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, and like Pocahontas and Mulan. Like those were kind of like my go-to Disney movies. No idea why. Maybe it's the music. I think it's probably the music.
There's some baller music, yeah.
Yeah, and so I really don't have a lot of knowledge in these quote unquote original stories or early stories that they're adapted from. With the exception of like Egyptian mythology, I was really into like Egyptology stuff when I was a kid. I mean, we can obviously talk about how problematic that is when we go to talk about a few movies that deal with Egyptian mythology, which I'm so excited to talk about. But I'm really interested in ancient history and just history in general. So that is one thing that I'm interested in talking about. But honestly, I remember Cullen telling me about this post saying that like, I want to be the person on the podcast who just reacts to things. That's me. So I've achieved my life's goal.
We'll basically be doing fairy tale and fantasy movies. So that's a broad description. Generally, I'm saying there has to be some kind of magical or fantastical element. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, maybe we'll get to it eventually, but I would say like Hilary Duff's Cinderella story, say, is a fairy tale adaptation, but I wouldn't consider it in our area because it's entirely realistic. Like Jennifer Coolidge is a real person, so...
she's in Uber Eats commercials and she's like, can I eat this? Not sponsored by Uber Eats
yet. But like so we're kind of leaning against like that, away from that genre. We might get to it eventually. So kind of anything that's kind of set in like another world or a world with magic. We might get to them eventually, but right now there's so much discourse around J.K. Rowling, and existing, unpacking all that, both her current works and her past works.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I have the mental fortitude to deal with that, because I grew up in a no Harry Potter house, no witchcraft, no Harry Potter. And then I kind of watched a couple of the movies, and then pretty soon it was like, it came out that she like not just like doesn't understand, but just actively spends a lot of time and money to hate on trans people.
Yeah.
And
but it's like, what are we going to add to the conversation for those topics? Because I know like a lot of people will probably want us to maybe dive into that eventually, but like right now there are plenty of much smarter and well-informed people talking about the issues with her and her works and the issues within Harry Potter. And it wouldn't be fair to just talk about Harry Potter without really acknowledging that. So it's kind of a thing we probably would want to work up to.
Yeah. And it means a lot to a lot of people, but it doesn't really mean a lot to us. So like, I feel like we're not the best.
I do love Harry Potter, but because of everything that's gone on, it has, because normally right around now I would be restarting the books. Like I usually start it in the fall and read through Christmas. I haven't really had the desire to. So that's what kind of sucks. But there's plenty to critique about the whole thing. We're just not there yet. Episode 1. Let's talk about J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
And you're probably gonna find throughout this podcast, I mean, most of this person's media is TV series, which after having to watch all of Glee, we probably won't be doing TV shows. But I have personal beef with George R.R. Martin. He can't finish a book series. He posits things as historically accurate, even when they're not, which is fine because it's fantasy, there's dragons. But people are like, the real Middle Ages was like this. And I'm like, actually, men weren't the main people helping deliver children in the Middle Ages. And blowing up a cathedral meant you would be murdered by a mob and whatever. But I also think there's just a lot of discourse around it, and other people that care more can talk about it, and I don't feel like devoting a lot of time to an extended rape fantasy.
And honestly, I like Game of Thrones, the show, but it's an exhausting thing to dig into because there are 1,000 characters, and then it's just it's a lot, and we're not a Game of Thrones podcast.
I'd have to mentally build myself up to take in that much physical and sexual violence. Just honestly.
No, like, that's a really good point.
Like I love Lord of the Rings. I went through a huge obsession, read the Silmarillion and everything. Those are long, so like we want to cover them, but I'm already trying to like mentally build up to, okay, I have to sit down for 3 hours. And there is a lot of violence, and it's pretty fantasy. It's stylized. It's not like horrific in that same way, but it's still a lot. So but we're excited about this podcast. Sorry for the long intro. Maybe we'll cut some of this, maybe we won't. Who knows?
And this won't happen every episode.
So our first episode, we're talking about something. I wanted to pick a movie that I didn't have a strong love or hatred for. So a movie I saw on TV once in high school, but also a movie that is connected to people that are very foundational to our modern perception of fairy tales and fantasy. They're gonna come up no matter where, like what we're talking about, like, so it's like, let's get them out of the way now so then we can like build on that foundation.
We wanted to pick a really historically accurate version of these people's lives.
Yes, because academic professor types have a lot of exciting things. Actually, check out Grimm Reading, the podcast. They have a great episode on the Brothers Grimm, and they're like going into more detail about their life. And they are actually involved in a lot of exciting things, because there's a lot going on in Germany in that time period. So check that out, because we have a movie to talk about. We have a 2005 movie to talk about.
2005?
Yeah. I think this was the same year Chronicles of Narnia came out, which is funny because the special effects in that movie still really hold up.
The Brothers Grimm, Heath Ledger, Matt Damon. It is a movie.
Had you seen this movie before?
So I'm pretty sure I have, because it's either that or I was just like really aware that it existed because I knew who was in it and I had a very vague idea of what it was about. It's about the lives of the Brothers Grimm, quote unquote. I think I was in middle school when I saw it, probably like 11 or 12-ish, so probably just a couple years after it came out. But I don't really have a strong opinion about it. I just kind of know that it was a thing. But other than that, I could not have predicted that's what this was.
Yeah, I feel like that's how society reacted to this movie. It's a movie.
Certified rotten for both critics and the audience. And I was like, oof.
Would Harry Styles say it's a movie though?
I mean,
it's a movie. It's a real theater movie.
I would actually have wanted to see this in theaters, I think. If I could go to like a cheapy theater and just be like, hey, I'll give you $5 to put this movie on the screen. Like, you know, I think this would be one. I think I'd pay $5 to go see it in theaters. We'll talk about like the sets and stuff. The look is really interesting.
Yeah.
So that would be cool to see on the screen, I think.
Yeah. So, okay, the Brothers Grimm IRL. Who do you think they are, Hannah? Especially after seeing this movie. What do you know about the Brothers Grimm?
Well, before this movie, well, actually, no, the knowledge is still the same. From what I understand, they're the two people who wrote the story, some fairy tales, some folklore, right?
Yeah.
I think they wrote Rumpelstiltskin. That sounds right. Maybe Cinderella or something with ogres, though not Shrek. And then, so another thing is, as a kid, I'm pretty sure that like, if you had asked me, you know, like who they are, I would have probably told you that they experienced the actual creatures and fantasy tales that they wrote about as if those things were real. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get confirmation during this podcast episode that is not true. But like, obviously, like my adult brain is like, that's not a thing. And they wrote grim versions of the story tales. They're not always happy. Hence the name. That's probably their actual name, but you know.
Yeah, here's my little spoiler is Grimm's tales are not particularly more dark or grim than other fairy tales. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people will just say in the Grimm's version because they mean something dark or scary. But actually it'll be like an Italian version, you know. You get that all with Sleeping Beauty, or like the Brothers Grimm Cinderella that's a little more violent was published more recently than the Cinderella, the French one that the Disney movie is based on, the one that most people know with the godmother and it's all kind of like sweet, you know, that is written down before the Brothers Grimm. Interesting. So it's not this kind of like the narrative you see constructed in a lot of like internet discourse is not true. Shocker. Okay, yeah, and they did do Rumpelstiltskin.
I was right.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds Germanish, so I was like, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't think they have ogres though. I think ogres are more French stuff.
Oh. I mean, it makes sense based on how the word ogre is spelled.
Yeah. So here's another spoiler: the Brothers Grimm were brothers.
Whoa.
They were born in Hanau in the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel, within the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire, quick summary, Germany did not exist until like brief, like 50 or so years before World War I. German people lived in like a bunch of little kingdoms and states ruled over by all these different dukes and counts and princes. And they had this weird, complicated system that was called the Holy Roman Empire. And it was a thing that Pope and Charlemagne invented because they didn't want to be like, the Pope didn't want to rely on the Byzantine Empire, which was the remnants of the Roman Empire in the East, and Istanbul to Constantinople. That's where it was based. And then so he teamed up with Charlemagne and they made the Holy Roman Empire, which existed basically until 1806. So pretty,
That's
I guess
pretty
it
recent.
worked. Yeah, yeah. So the person who kind of caused the end of it is someone you may know from the Minions franchise. He's one of the Minions bosses. His name
Oh,
is
I thought you were gonna say it
Napoleon.
was. I thought it was gonna be one of the minions. Like I don't know any of their names. Bob, that's probably a name of a minion.
Yeah. So you can thank the Minions and Napoleon for the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm.
Um, and
Thank you, minions. I
thanks,
salute
Minions.
you.
They're born in 1785 and 1786, so they are very close in age.
The
Jacob,
Brothers Grimm, not the
not the
minions.
Minions, not the Minions. The Minions are prehistoric, as you will know from the Minions
Yes,
movie. Yeah,
of course. I'm
but
all up on that lore.
Jacob and Wilhelm. So Jacob was the older one, and then Wilhelm.
And then the movie, it's opposite.
Yeah. But though Jacob was the intellectual and Wilhelm was the kind of the ladies' man, but at the end of the day, they're both professors. But
right.
So they were 2 of 9 siblings, and only 3 seemed to die in infancy. I'm getting like
that's a pretty good
numbers.
rate.
Yeah, yeah. So, but when Jacob was 11, their dad, who was like a administrator, a lawyer, clerk type, he died, and so then they were super broke. They couldn't afford to eat, and this would be a pattern until later in life. They'd often be very poor. This would be a theme. They're also Lutheran and very religious. They were able to get money to study because their aunt was a lady in waiting to the count's wife, the countess. And that's really nepotism, baby. But you know what? They needed whatever they could get. You know, I don't fault them for being nepo babies. Because they were like literally like had trouble affording to eat. So like very different than what we think of. So eventually they were really bright. And they studied at the University of Marburg. They had to ask special permission to like study law and certain things because they weren't considered highborn. So the lady in waiting, she had to put in a word for them. And the stipends to study, they only went to like highborn or rich students. So it was like reverse financial aid, which is honestly probably what would have gotten if Trump got a second term. Yeah, getting political. So they couldn't afford to eat or party, and they like would live in like tiny rooms together. So other boys were like drinking and horseback riding, and they were studying, but that meant they had to work really hard, and they became very nerdy. So eventually, 1808, they worked for the King of Westphalia. So Westphalia was a puppet state made by Napoleon of several different entities. I put it anachronistically in a medieval fairy tale fantasy script of mine based on a Brothers Grimm story, because one of my personal dreams is for a YouTuber to make a video about something I write, complaining about its historical inaccuracy, while it features singing, talking animals, and nymphs.
Your dream is to be very petty.
Yes. To be petty towards a very niche kind of person.
Just like one tweet to destroy them all. It would just be like, there are talking animals and birds in my film. Period.
They were paid very badly, but they didn't have a lot of instructions, so they could just do whatever. So they would write books on German, Norse mythology, other folklore. They're major in linguistics, like hugely influential. Like their work is still cited today. And they kind of paved the way for a lot of our understanding of Germanic and Scandinavian culture. They really kind of paved the way also for Tolkien. And I think through their influence on Tolkien and Tolkien's major influence on fantasy as a genre, that's why Western European mythology is so like Germanic heavy. Like elves, dwarves, those are Germanic creatures. And that kind of supplanted. So you had like classical mythology, which had like centaurs and naiads and gods, and you had like French lore, which would be like kind of epics about knights, and sometimes there'd be like fairies or sorceresses, and you know, Arthurian lore kind of fits into that. So kind of a Celtic-ish area, you know, those were the more dominant forms of fantasy, and through Tolkien and through the Grimms, through Tolkien, kind of made Germanic fantasy more dominant. Is this a accurate research claim? No, I just made it right now. I just thought of it while making the notes, but I think there's some weight to it. So, okay, Wilhelm married the daughter of an apothecary or pharmacist. I wonder if they had receipts and how long those receipts were. Um,
Yeah, I mean, did they do like discounts that like people are never going to take advantage of? And I feel bad because those people have to wait for that long ass receipt to print out.
I know.
And then it's like this long, and then they got to fold it up and give it to you or put it in the bag. It's embarrassing for everyone involved.
For society. Wilhelm did get married to Dorchen. She was one of the Wild sisters who were their like neighbors, and they were friends with their sister Lottie, and they provided some of the stories in the Grimm's collection. So the brothers kind of provided for their family their whole lives. They paid for their other brothers' art school, who would later go on to draw illustrations for their book. They really broke, especially because when they first, in 1812, when they first published their fairy tales, their publisher ripped them off. But they eventually, got it around. So their whole thing was they collected stories. They weren't writing their own inventions. They were collecting them. So it was kind of part of the Romantic movement, a response to the Enlightenment. So kind of like trying to get in touch with the voice of the people and rural life and like honest peasants. And I kind of get it because I think I maybe hate the Enlightenment. I don't know. I haven't thought too much about it recently, but it's also kind of, there's a nationalism to it. So especially with the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire and the invasion and the rise of Napoleon. So German people were trying to find a shared identity, like what it meant to be German. And they're doing that through language and then through folklore. Like these are our stories. So yes, they did get some stories from peasants. Like he did like trick a grandma into telling her grandchildren stories while he listened and like wrote them down. But mainly they would just like talk to their friends who are like other like middle class or wealthy people about stories. And so that meant like stories that had come from literature and entered the oral tradition, and like oral stories were all kind of mixed. So it was just it's hard to always determine where a story comes from. They were very smart and academic, but like it doesn't really hold up by today's standards because it was a little sloppy. Like they would make things try and sound more rustic, and then they would add like kind of poetic elements to like make them more marketable, especially when they started selling with children and families. So they made it less academic and more like, zhuzhed it up a bit, so they would also like sometimes add more violence or tone down sexual elements or add religious elements or, stricter morals. So they fussed around with the stories quite a bit, and stories would get added and subtracted, sometimes for being too French. But they did get a lot of stories from Huguenot, which were French Protestants kicked out of France because, being Protestant threatened French royal power, and also like the French's desire to have like a wild good time. So they were kicked out, which is a bad thing. No one should be kicked out of their home. But that's how like there's certain stories that have very well traced French origins that kind of made their way to Germany. But also the borders between Germany and France were nebulous for a very long time. But they would remove certain French words and concepts. So the word prince is French, right? So a lot of times in the Brothers Grimm stories, it'll say the king's son because that's a German word. Or like fairies the word fairy is French. So they would often put like witch or wise woman. So there aren't actually any fairies in the Brothers Grimm stories. You might run into elves, dwarves, nixies, which are like water spirits, but there are no fairies. They also kind of connect stuff to like ancient German religion and mythology. They moved to Hanover, which is where the current monarchy of England is from. And some drama happened when Queen Victoria became queen because she couldn't also be Queen of Hanover because women couldn't be queen or king in Hanover, like that kind of. So it involved like this really conservative person coming to power, and the Brothers Grimm like protesting and like being kicked out. Eventually they had their Berlin period in Prussia, and they did more art stuff. They did politics for a little bit. Jacob was at the Congress of Vienna, which is kind of how they redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon. But they really, at their heart, were academics. Nerd bros to the bitter end, as I say. Okay, so it's our first episode. Let's talk about the Holocaust.
Oh, what a segue.
So you have to mention the anti-Semitism. Like, you'll have to talk about it at some point. So it existed in Europe and Germany. You know, Martin Luther was like, kill all the Jews. And there are plenty of people before him saying that.
Mhm.
And so there are a couple stories in this like 200 plus story collection that feature anti-Semitism. It's very like kind of like Shakespeare level. Like it's very standard for the time. The Good Bargain and The Jew and the Brambles. You know, as a kid, I never read these because they had boring titles. I was like, okay, a Jew, a
Right.
person from the Bible. I'm gonna read something about like a talking animal. Like, like I'm like, okay. But so I thankfully avoided those. So the all right pipeline didn't get me. But like so you mentioned Rumpelstiltskin. People have talked about how, you know, that's kind of Jewish coded, like the long
Mhm.
name, the connection with gold and stealing babies,
Yeah.
which we will get to when it comes to certain character coding in Tangled. um
Mm.
so this is common in folk stories, and even like Hans Christian Andersen has some really condescending story about a Jewish girl, like yikes. But they wrote down these stories without a that's a yikes from me dog. They just put them in. We're like, yeah, this is the story. And they also put them in collections especially made for children. So they
Mhm.
were fine with giving children this content. You know, in their political careers, though, they were in like this like committee where they voted to be like, yeah, Jews should have rights and be parts of society. So I don't think they had like a personal hatred to the Jews. They just like were involved with the anti-Semitism of their time, you know, and they
Right.
didn't see a problem with sharing that. So that is, as the kids would say, problematic. But I think when you say this person in history was anti-Semitic, especially in like European history, you have to break down what that means, because that could be anything from the Pope told me to burn the Talmuds and I'm gonna do that, or like I'm gonna like mass murder these people, because all of that
Right.
happened. Like there's so much anti-Semitism in European history. So like you have to explain what it means, and that's not excusing it. That's just being like, this is the level this person was at. And like even the fact that the Brothers Grimm are like Protestant, that affects the values in their stories compared to
Mhm.
well, eventually at some point we'll be talking about Charles Perrault, who worked for Louis XIV and was French, and his stories have a kind of not a Catholic twist, and like we're gonna go pray the rosary right now, but like you can see how those values are reinforced, you know. So that
Mhm.
is the religion is so important in that context, especially because before racism was really invented in the way we know now, religion was the thing people used to other
Right.
each other, you know.
Mhm.
So, and then so how this gets into the Holocaust is the Nazis used these stories, and Hitler said, yep, everyone should own these books to promote anti-Semitic values.
Mm.
Now, it wasn't just the ones where it's straight up like we're the Jews the villain, but they're like they found ways to be like, yeah, Little Red Riding Hood is about like the Jews are the wolf and the girl is the Aryans, and like
Mm.
they it's not that there's something inherently evil in these stories. They were using them as propaganda and twisting
Right.
them and adding that element, and you being like, yeah, the honest like German hero versus like violence, and you need to violently destroy our enemies. So when the Allies won, you know, think British, think American. You know, if something horrible happens, it's definitely not because centuries of political and religious sanctioned violence and discrimination. It's definitely because people have a culture, and that culture is not yours, and therefore it's bad.
Mm. Mhm.
So the Brothers Grimm was banned for a while in Germany by the Allies because, in a history that, you know, BuzzFeed will continue to this day, Cinderella is going to be blamed for things way over her pay grade. They're like, Holocaust, Cinderella's fault. You know, like that's really the thing is like, yes, there's a point in that the violence and the anti-Semitism found in these stories was found by someone and used to promote bad values, but it's not something inherent to the story. And like a lot of ancient texts and older texts and things that come from history, you can make it say whatever you want. I mean, I did high school debate. I learned I could find a piece of evidence to prove literally opposite points, you know. So I think when you talk about the Brothers Grimm, you have to mention this level of how it affected German culture in this negative way, because to not would to be ignoring something that's pretty big. But that also doesn't mean, you know, it needs to be in like a banned book list. Or like there's that thing going around TikTok. Some very young person like made a list of like problematic authors, and it's like Colleen Hoover, Shakespeare, like all over the map. And people kind of were talking about how the internet has really reduced discourse to be like, this is just problematic and we shouldn't read it. You know, is the main character in Lolita a very bad person?
Okay.
Yes. Is the book saying that's okay?
No.
No.
It's, yeah. There's so much nuance in the way media and stories are used in different contexts. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Bible. You could say that about any piece of media that's ever been written. You know, just because the way it's used one way doesn't make it inherently bad. There are plenty of ways to break something down and figure out what's really going on. So it's the internet simplifies things because our attention spans are the length of TikToks.
Yes.
Apparently.
And honestly, some TikToks I'm like, this is getting a little long.
Yeah.
So, but basically, to sum it up, the impact of the Grimms on folklore, pop culture, and linguistics cannot be overstated. Their stories are some of the big fairy tale heavy hitters. They inspired people to do the same thing all across Europe, you know, like to collect their folk stories. And that, you know, a lot of that has been and would have more of it would have been lost if they hadn't, you know, encouraged that. So, very influential. The Brothers Grimm movie. No one blinked. No one noticed.
Certified rotten.
It was,
which is a shame.
It was a spec script though. That got a lot of rewrites, but it was a spec script, which makes it kind of a magical creature of its own.
Yeah.
Spec
some little
made
lingo.
into a movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Spec script is kind of just like a tester that you send out to people like, hey, look at how great I am at writing. And if something like that like gets picked up, like there's something there. And I wouldn't disagree with this movie as it became. There's something there that's really interesting.
Yeah, I would say the premise really good.
Mm-hmm.
The third act workish elements, like I can see it. I think the middle and the build up to that is really what kills it.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of delve into that. But there were studio rewrites. Those could have been for better or for worse. The world will never know.
Yep.
And this Taron Gillam directed it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they're a good director, I think. At least you know that name. But I don't know if they did a good job in this movie. I'll say that.
Yeah, everyone was making lots of strange choices. And I don't want to just like blame the director, but like they're the leader of the project. So
well, and because they're all like good actors who I've seen be good in other things.
So exactly. Like... That's what's really strange. Although I have to say, like, we can obviously get into it later, but like I found Heath Ledger to be weirdly charming, even though he was making some bananas choices. But like, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of feel like someone who decided to cast him in The Dark Knight saw this movie and they're like, oh yeah, this guy's great. Because it is like weird choices, but for some reason they kind of work. So he's got this weird kind of range that he can do. It was also just really nice to see him in a movie because like I hadn't seen one of his movies in a long time. The Dark Knight is really the only one I ever go back to. I don't love the Shakespeare version movie, 10 Things I Hate About You. I know that might be controversial.
I think we need to talk more about the Minions to Napoleon to Brothers Grimm to this movie to the Dark Knight pipeline.
It's like we're playing that Wikipedia roulette game where you're just like trying to connect, you know, Hitler to Kevin Bacon or something. There's some really good foundation here.
Yeah.
But it's such a strange movie.
Yeah, and we're not gonna go like beat by beat because you know we do that for an episode of Glee.
This movie is 2 hours long.
Yeah, and we spent 2 hours on a 45-minute episode of Glee, so we can't do that. So basically, quick kind of summary: the Grimm brothers are like these con artists, but Jake, the younger one of this version, is academic and interested in fairy tales and folklore, and they kind of like hunt down fictional monsters from folklore.
It weirdly was like, is this like a precursor to Supernatural? Because Supernatural literally comes out like a couple years later, I think.
Oh my god!
Like it kind of has some of those vibes.
Oh yeah, Trauma Brothers.
Yeah. Well, the fictional creature thing, like, because clearly, spoiler alert, by the end of the movie, it seems like they're probably gonna pursue like actual real life folklore things that are coming to life. But yeah, that idea of like these brothers band together to help fight off evil for the community, even though it's fake at the beginning.
And so this French general catches them and he pairs them with this annoying Italian torture man, Cavaldi, who the movie thinks is a lot funnier than he is. And...
This movie thinks it's a lot funnier than it is.
Yeah.
The score was telling me to laugh, but I couldn't find anything funny in the
scenes.
scenes.
One of my notes was, is this a comedy? Like, I didn't remember it as a comedy from years and years ago. I was like,
No, this is like a borderline horror movie. Like it's pretty scary. Like if like a little kid saw this, like
yeah.
it's pretty intense.
So they have to go to Marbaden for these missing girls. They're getting kidnapped by the forest, and that's like a good premise. Like that premise of con artists have to solve a mystery that turns out to be real. I'm pretty sure that's a Scooby-Doo movie, at least a few of them. Like solid premise.
Yeah, actually, I think it is the no, it was the first like live action Scooby-Doo. I think it turns out to be fake at that island. Because it turns out to be Scrappy-Doo. I'm sorry, I spoiled Scooby-Doo.
Oh yeah, there's gonna be spoilers for anything we talk about.
Yeah. But the second one I think may have been real. Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, though, that's amazing film. Would love to talk about that on this podcast.
we will.
Zombies. Turns out to be real. So
yeah. I do remember asking Rafa, my husband, you know, who was your favorite Scooby-Doo character? And he said Scrappy, and I was like, red flag.
Yeah, I was like, what are you doing? Scrappy? Okay, Scrappy-Doo isn't even like he's canonical, but okay, we're getting into Scooby-Doo now, but
we'll get there later. We'll get to the Scoob franchise. So they're in the dark forest with the help of Angelica, this girl bossy guide. There's this wolf huntsman who's there and turns out to be her dad with a silver axe that can control the forest.
A pseudo werewolf because he seems to like physically transform.
Which that was actually cool. I did like how he transformed.
And so I know that like I kind of looked at your notes and saw that you guys were writing down like the fairy tale references. So does that mean they wrote Twilight? I'm confused. Brothers, like, did they write Twilight?
They did.
Werewolves.
They did. Which is funny, you know, werewolf hunts were as common as witch hunts.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they were hunting down men as werewolves.
I mean, men often, it's a mix, and men often that were accused and died of witchcraft too.
Yeah.
Sorry to ruin some sassy feminist poetry books and t-shirts. This is all happening because there's an evil undead queen in a tower trying to regain her youth and beauty with a spell, because apparently she wants that to take over the world. Why she can't do that as undead, I don't know. But there's a lot of
pretty immobile.
I guess she's just like lying on a bed.
And she's got, you know, when people get like really long acrylic nails, I don't know how they get anything done. And this woman, her nails are curling. I don't know how she gets anything done. So you know what? I don't blame her. She needs those girls to get young again.
There are a lot of pointless antics in the middle. It's just like noise happening and like rah, and like you're like, what are these characters even doing in this scene? Like, what is their goal? You know? And then the French come and they try and burn down the forest, but they fail because the queen blows it out with an ice wind.
Okay,
Elsa who?
I have a question. Why does the French general send them? Like, what does he hope to gain?
He
like,
wants them to stop it. But if he thinks they're con artists, how would he be good at? And why does he care?
That's why I was like, does he want to like rid that area of folklore so they're like more susceptible to his power of taking them over or something? I didn't understand any of the politics happening.
I think so. I think that's what they're trying to say. I think it would have made more sense if like there were French officials trying to stop it, and the fact that they couldn't like made them look bad and like led to unrest.
Right. Yeah. Like if they were like, you're technically our police, like you need to fix this and help us, and then they're just like incompetent, but then why would they go to these con artists? Like maybe if it was explicit, like I need you to convince them that this is fake, you know, find the fake.
Or what if it was their job to convince them it was real? Like they were trying to like hide weapons or like hostages or something in the forest. They were trying to use it as a military base, and they didn't want like the peasants coming around, and so they wanted the Brothers Grimm to like make people scared.
Right. Yeah, there's something missing about the entire connective tissue of this story. But again, there's something there.
Yeah.
There's something there.
Yeah, like sometimes you see a movie, you're like, how did this get made? And this, I like, okay, this makes
sense. Love that
this
podcast. Definitely listen to them. Not sponsored by How Did This Get Made, but we should collab.
Shout out. So the general eventually like tries to kill them. He gets killed. They defeat the evil queen by shattering her mirror. She has this mirror that like reflects things as they were when she was like beautiful, and her tower wasn't all dusty.
It's like a manipulation device, sort of like you get entranced by it.
Yeah, which I actually liked that. I thought that was cool.
That's interesting.
And then they break the mirror and they awaken.
And then she shatters.
She shatters. They awaken
pieces everywhere.
And the pieces have like talking eyeballs and shit.
Talking eyeballs,
yeah.
At the end, a bird flies away with one of her eyeball glass shards. So, and terrible FX. We'll talk about.
Yeah, did not age as well as Narnia. So, and then Will kisses Angelica, which wakes her up, and we will get into
no,
that.
Jake kisses Angelica.
Will kisses Angelica, and then Angelica kisses Will.
No, Heath Ledger kisses Angelica.
Oh, he's Jake.
Yes.
I'm getting them mixed up because Will is younger IRL.
Yes. So Jake, Heath Ledger, his character kisses Angelica to wake her up. True love's kiss, it works. And then his brother is like dying. Will, he's dying, and they're like, maybe you have to kiss your brother. And so there's like weird sexual tension that I definitely saw throughout the film, and this was confirmed at the end here. But he like was about to kiss him, and then like Will, who's like, I still don't know how he's not dead. Like he was stabbed in the heart, and this is like what, the 1800s?
Yeah. Okay.
No idea the logic here, but Heath Ledger's character, who is supposedly the love interest, I still don't understand the foundation for that either, but is the love interest for Angelica.
Is he?
And he right. That's what I don't know. But he supposedly is, I think. And then he like lets Angelica kiss Will because Will's like, no, let her kiss me. And then they like make out, and she's like, ah ha ha ha. And I'm like, creepy.
Well, okay, just a layer to that. So Dorchen, the Will's wife, IRL, Jacob always lived with them, and she always joked that she had 2 husbands. Now,
interesting.
You can interpret that in a weird way. I think it's honestly just she's like, oh, I'm taking care of 2 guys, you know, you can make it weird, but I don't think it was. But like they were always like a family unit. So the way this movie does the romance stuff, okay. Let's talk. I'm glad
I'm not the only one who's like, wait, who is supposed to be the love interest? Because it seems like Jake seems to have a crush on her, but they never spend time together. Really.
And like they have like these sexual tension scenes with like Angelica and Will, because Will is like the hot, horny one. And Angelica is, I guess, into it. She's played by Cersei, right?
Yes, Cersei Lannister. What's so interesting, and clearly this was not at all planned, but the sort of connection between how we're introduced to Angelica, played by Lena Headey, aka Cersei, is that the character of her father in Game of Thrones, Tywin Lannister, is introduced nearly the exact same way, skinning an animal and like gutting an animal. It's so crazy how like similar their introductions are. It's wild.
Yeah.
She's gutting a rabbit.
She's like a woodsy person.
She's Katniss.
She's a Katniss. And I wrote, is this a fraternal throuple? Because it's like they say, because they're like, yeah, I know Jake, you're in love with her. And I'm like, when did we get that?
Nope. They have never even looked at each other, I don't think.
He just says your art is good. And like they're like,
and she looks at him kind of like considering that a little bit, and then she's back to doing whatever she was doing.
Well, like I get the vibe, like their vibe was that like she liked him more than Will because he was like nice to her.
Yeah, but she didn't like him.
She was like, oh, of these 2 people, like this one isn't garbage.
This one I could be, friendly with.
Yeah, because Will is just like sexist to her the whole time.
And they continuously just like waltz into her house.
They're like
knocking.
And then they, okay. So then to get to the end, so like True Love's Kiss is not in really the Brothers Grimm. It is a Disney trope. Is it one of my favorite fairy tale tropes? Yes. But okay, so Will and Jake have conflict as brothers, as the main characters. In the climax, like Will finally tells Jake, I believe in you, and lets Jake stab him so he can defeat the queen or whatever. So I get that there's this resolution here, but like when Will was dying, I was expecting him to say something like, oh, I love you, or like some kind of like sibling love saves him. But It wasn't 2013. We weren't ready for that Frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think their issue from the beginning was the magic beans thing, right? That Jake was so invested in fairy tales and this lore, this folklore, and Will was like the practical one, I guess, who was like, no, it's not real. And so like he would always keep saying magic beans, like to convince him, like, hey, get back to reality. He would say that to Jake. And so I think at the end when he's like, I believe in you, is like, I believe you. Yeah. Like, I'm flying while sword fighting with you. I believe that this shit is real.
Yeah, because okay, and we'll get into Jack and the Beanstalk, but the backstory is that Jake sold their cow for magic beans to cure their sister, and their sister died. And Will brings this up all the time. I would not hang out with someone who brought up a dumb thing I did as a kid that had real traumatic consequences. So, if someone treated me like that, I would be like,
I didn't even put that together because I was like, oh, the magic beans thing is like snap to reality, but it's more like, hey, remember when you killed our sister, essentially?
Yeah.
I didn't even put that together. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna like, I don't know, move to Bavaria. Hopefully Napoleon kills you. Bye. Like, it would have made more sense if Will somehow saved, or Jake somehow saved Will. But instead we have the like, ooh, gay homo joke. I think I wrote, I love a gay homo brothers joke. And by that, I mean, I hate it. I mean, like, why do we need to make it weird? And like, no homo, they're literally brothers. Why would it be homo?
Why would there be homo? Yeah. It's like.
So was he pretending to be unconscious to make out with Angelica? That's what I took away after they rolled around.
That's actually a good point. So if maybe, because at the point that is she a witch, I guess? Because she stole people's spells. Yeah. So the witch, essentially, she dies. So maybe that like cured his wound.
Yeah.
But I was literally like, this is the 1800s. You've just been stabbed. Like, you're dead.
You're
like,
dead. Well,
you're in a remote village and there are no doctors.
Unless that old hag in the town counts. But like, but yeah, and then he's like, not you, not funny. That's my response. But like, he's dying.
And he literally like, he romantically, I'm sorry, it is romantic. He like cups Will's face and like, they're like inches away. I think this is like right after or right around the same time as Brokeback Mountain. So like Heath Ledger doing gay stuff is like not new. Matt Damon though, maybe. But yeah, we're getting so hung up on this brothers kiss, but like it's so weird.
It was so weird, and it was at like the climax of the film, essentially. Yeah. So like I was expecting like this really healing moment between the brothers, but they're like, I guess it makes you real. It's been so overdone since like that era of Frozen, like 2012, 2013, because there was Frozen, Maleficent, the season 1 finale, Once Upon a Time, that all kind of subverted true love's kiss as something that's romantic, but like.
So you're saying this movie crawled so that Frozen could run?
This movie didn't crawl.
Because this movie was so slow.
This movie didn't move. This movie, like, they didn't move the conversation forward, obviously, because they're like, there was a gay joke and then the woman stepped in to kiss him, Like, it makes you appreciate those works more and how far we've come, and that we can acknowledge that, like, siblings can truly love each other and can sacrifice for each other, and even if they're the same gender. Yeah.
It's so strange.
Do you want to talk about these characters?
Let's get into it. Who's the protagonist, Cullen?
Who has the strongest desire, baby? Shout out to Scott Thompson.
Yeah, because I'm like, okay, clearly it's Will for like the first half of the movie, and then like we're switching to Jake?
I did feel like Will was, because he was the skeptic and he was like handling Jake. But then
he was the one taking these jobs, clearly. Like he was the one managing the money and like, we have to do this to make money. And Jake's like, I just want to write my stories.
And then Jake does defeat the queen, and he really wants it to be real.
He's the one that pushes Will to even be like, no, this is real. And Jake's like, psh, or vice versa. Will's like, psh. And it's like, so he becomes the protagonist. It's so strange. So, and I mean,
I don't think this movie knew. I think this movie was like, we have both. They're both the protagonists.
Yeah. I clearly didn't take a Scott Thompson class. But the other thing that is really interesting about that is like, do we, like I saw in your notes, like, do we root for the protagonist? And I don't root for Will at all. He doesn't have a single save the cat moment.
No, he's just a sexist jerk. He's a con artist who bullies his brother.
He literally bullies him, like, pretty
Angelica
badly.
talks about, oh, like you're concerned that he won't survive, and that's why you care about him. And I'm like, I could buy that if the movie showed it to me earlier. But right now, it's just like, remember when you killed our sister? You idiot who likes fairy tales and doesn't want to have sex with twins right now. Like, it's like, yes, I could believe. Like, I'm like, it should have ended with the brother Grimm. Like, Will dies, and Jake's like, oh, finally, I can just write my stories in peace.
Yeah. And also, I think with sort of Brothers Grimm erasure, I guess, is like, Will isn't involved in writing these stories at all. It's sort of just like a fluke that Jake is doing it, and Will's not really involved. And from what I'm understanding is they were very involved IRL together.
Yeah. And they have this thing, oh, I'm thinking a career change at the end, like implying that now they're going to write the stories. And the movie ends like Once Upon a Time, or the end, or Happily Ever After, but maybe not. And I'm like, did they think they were getting a sequel?
Yeah, right. That was.
What would they have done?
They would have gone on another adventure where the folklore is real. It would have been but then Supernatural came out and they're like, well, can't do that. But also it was certified rotten and they're like, you can't have any more of our money.
Yeah. Well, because the fact that a fantasy film was made off a spec script is wild to me.
Yeah.
Like, I wish it was still that way. That is not happening. Though I think there's also conflict because Harvey wasn't liking how things were happening. So
yeah.
Harvey Weinstein.
Was it his father or his brother?
His brother and
his brother, yeah. His brother was sort of running Dimension Films at the time. This movie.
Every time someone thinks about Harvey Weinstein, Gwyneth Paltrow sells a vagina-scented candle. So you're welcome, Gwyneth. Okay, Jake is like flailing around and I can't get a read on him. I don't know, like, that's the thing with the choices. Everyone's like flailing around all the time. Yes. But like specifically Heath Ledger's Jake, and I like can't tell. Like, I can't tell like what is this character's personality.
Quirky and weird.
But like he's just like stretching in weird ways. It's like someone needed to get these actors to like control their bodies, because I feel like I'm watching like a middle school class. Like,
he was like the most interesting part, like in terms of the acting for me, because I literally was like, oh, like this is why he was cast in The Dark Knight. Like, I get it, but like, and it is hard to get a read on like who he is and what he really wants. Like, I mean, it's a bad sign if like near like the end of the movie your characters have to ask each other what they want, because like clearly the audience doesn't know what they want. That's not a good sign. Well, storytelling tip.
It's also just, I think they were flailing because they wanted to be a comedy, and they're like, flailing is funny, and like we're gonna have this Italian guy who just shouts things and shoots shit and
says grazie instead of grazie. So that's a thing.
So we can briefly mention, we can talk about Angelica. She's kind of a protagonist, a secondary protagonist. She's a love interest.
Kind of.
So she
gets kissed a lot.
She fits the late 90s, early 2000s, like pre-Katniss, like rough and tumble girl boss character. So the thing about Katniss is there are lots of characters copying her that aren't as good, and sometimes Katniss gets lumped in with them. Katniss is a pretty good character. But the thing about Katniss is she drives the story, right? It's her story. She is not an accessory to any man. And, I'm not saying you can't have stories with male protagonists and female secondary characters. That'd be dumb to say. But the thing with this character is she's very similar to Maid Marian in the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner. And that they do all these things, like they don't dress super girly and they're rough and tumble and they shoot bow and arrows. But in the story, they serve a damsel in distress function. They don't really defeat anything. They maybe contribute a little, but they're mainly there to be rescued. Now, contrast that with, the Maid Marian in the 1930s Errol Flynn Robin Hood. Yes, she wears pretty dresses most of the time, but she's a more active agent in the story. She like saves him a couple times. Like, even though she's not being an action hero, she has control over her own life and is making choices in the story. And that is an old movie, so this Angelica is this part of this Hollywood trend of like trying to be more feminist, at least appearance wise, but not really changing how they tell stories.
Yeah, her role really is to guide them through the forest, to not take of any of Will's fake scientific equipment bullshit, and also lick a toad to get them out of the forest.
And then the rest of the time she's just getting rescued from like the torture device, from Cavaldi is like tying her up.
Like the toad thing, and like the first time like we meet her and like she takes us into the forest, like it feels like the movie is making fun of people who very truly believe in the folklore of their culture, which is rude and a bit, dehumanizing. And so that's kind of like, it felt like we were making fun of her. Like the movie was trying to make fun of her because Will like clearly wasn't taking her seriously. And he was the protagonist at the time of that. So
but there are also times where she like, they're talking about the tower and the lore behind the tower, which we'll get to when we talk about the antagonist. But then she's like, it's just a story to scare children. I'm like, you licked a toad earlier.
Yeah, like you can believe it, girl. Just tell us. Like, yeah, I believe it.
I would have liked if they came and she's like, yeah, I believe it. Like, you gotta be careful. Don't go into the like, and then she can be like, yeah, your Enlightenment era equipment, garbage.
Because if she doesn't believe this story, why is she afraid of the forest? Like she sees the trees moving. Why doesn't she believe it? Like then now, like by the end of the movie, it's like, why would we believe her about anything? Like,
but she literally saw the trees move and knows that they move.
And like two of her sisters were kidnapped. Like two of those like 11 girls that had been kidnapped were her sisters, and that was her only family.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say my favorite characters are Sasha, the gender non-conforming little girl.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did this movie say like trans rights? I'm sorry. I think we should go over the line where that happened. Will, so like this girl has short hair,
she wears
wearing
pants.
a hat, wears pants, has a hat on at the time, and like you know how like little kids with little kid voices, they don't sound like any specific, sex or gender. So she runs up and like says something to her dad, and like Will is like, oh, strapping young lad, and then the dad's like, this lad is my daughter. And then Will literally says, he will make a good wife someday. And I was like, did this movie just say trans rights? What's going on?
Progressive. So, J.K. Rowling is shaking.
So that was like a weird tidbit. If anyone else out there like noticed this, please tell us your thoughts. Do you think it was a fluke? Or do you think this is like, it's probably just a joke, but like now in the context, I'm like, it could go either way, honestly.
Yeah. Because it wasn't like hateful to her. It didn't like, it wasn't a joke. It was just like, yeah, she's just a boyish little girl, like whatever.
He adapts to what, like the dad clearly isn't like necessarily like a offended. He's just like correcting.
Yeah.
And he adapts to that, but doesn't correct the gendered language. And it's so interesting.
Yeah.
But
this should be a text in gender studies course.
So also what's really interesting about this girl is she's one of the girls who's attempted kidnapped.
I think she does get kidnapped, yeah.
But then she gets returned, right?
Oh, she does get returned, yeah, they rescue her.
But okay, the way that this witch kidnaps these children is so weird. We'll obviously get into the horse one, but
Dude, well, I don't have it anywhere else in my notes. Talk about the horse one. Well, basically the wolf feeds the horse spiders, and then the horse like calls to Elsie, and this little girl pets the horse.
Little girl, right?
Yeah, she pets the horse, and then the spiders
okay, but I do have to say, this little girl, her acting was so creepy. I was like, this is a horror movie. She's literally saying like the thing that the wolf or the Red Riding Hood says, even though Red Riding Hood was already
in the movie.
Little glimpse of her. And then the horse like starts like spitting up web on her. This is like my nightmare, and I didn't even know that it existed. And then here I just thought like she was just gonna like get wrapped up and the spiders were gonna carry her. No, this horse that is spitting web at her swallows her, and then she's stuck inside this horse and it like runs. It is bananas. But
okay, Sasha now.
Sasha, oh my goodness, Sasha
Sasha Fierce.
Sasha Fierce, yes. Sasha is kidnapped by a well mud monster.
That's kind of the gingerbread man.
And then she like hardens into a gingerbread. She bites a piece of her hand and says, "I taste good." And then like runs away. And I'm like, okay, one, you're a mud monster. You don't taste good. And also two, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, but I was kind of like baffled by this. I was like, this is so weird. And I was kind of into that.
It's creative. It's not,
Yeah.
It could have been really lame and it was creative.
Yes. Like both of those things were very, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like good, but I'm glad they did something totally different that no one else can ever replicate.
Yeah.
Like who came up with that? I want to meet that person and just say hi to them because I don't want to shake their hand.
So my favorite character, so I'm really rooting for in this movie, is Sasha and Grandmother Toad. Because Matt Damon licks her and then she turns around and is like, lick me again,
I hated that.
She's
so
like, I'm
much.
a sexy Grandmother Toad. I'm like, you don't get your licks from Matt Damon, Grandmother Toad.
I hated that because I was like, why does this toad look like it's enjoying being like eaten out by this human? I was like, I hate this. It was so weird. Who's a character I'm rooting for? Honestly, I liked Jake's character. Like I thought, yes, he's weird. I don't really understand him, but like, I don't know. I could root for him because he wasn't evil.
And you want him to find a more fulfilling life than the one he had. He wanted more than this provincial life, like.
Yeah, and he didn't want to rip people off.
No.
Like Will didn't care.
He would have been happy to live in that village, like with Angelica, and write little stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. The antagonist.
Can we count that Italian guy as the antagonist?
Oh, he's in there. He's in here.
Horrible. Good.
Yeah. So we got the French general. He's played by the guy who plays the evil priest in Game of Thrones, the one who looks like Pope Francis.
There's a lot of Pirates of the Caribbean actors, and by a lot, I mean I think there's 2 or 3. He also plays Elizabeth's dad in Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh yeah. There's also a couple henchmen.
The guy who takes his eye out in Pirates of the Caribbean, he's in this movie. Mackenzie something. He's also in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, because there are those henchmen. Was he one of them?
Yes. Yeah, he was the one who played the witch at the beginning.
Yeah. There are these very forgettable henchmen. That's what I'll say about them. No one moved, no one spoke, no one remembers them. All right, so the French general, fine. Like whatever. We have Cavaldi. He's violent and abusive, and he gets this like redemption arc where he like doesn't want to shoot the Grimms because I guess he likes them now, even though he's making them like cross-dress and clean for him at one point.
There's literally no reason they should like each other because he was rude to them.
He murders their friends and tries to torture them multiple times. The only
reason
he tries to murder Angelica.
He became their friend was because he saw Sasha turn into the gingerbread man and was like, oh, this is real.
Yeah, but he tied up Angelica at one point and was like burning her paintings and shit, and like he didn't care about these kids. He's just not a good man. And I'm like, we didn't need him.
No, it didn't make any sense why he existed. Not funny.
Okay, let's talk about the queen.
Oh, do you want to talk about the wolf guy though?
He's just,
what's with his weird axe?
He has a silver axe that pushes the trees away.
What is that?
Which I guess, the reason why silver repels like werewolves and vampires?
No.
So apparently it's because people often believe Judas was the first vampire. The one from the Lady Gaga song. But he was believed to be the first vampire, and he didn't like silver because it reminded him of the betrayal.
Interesting.
Because silver, like, there aren't really any metals. Like, Christianity doesn't have metal lore.
Just people?
People, because I think there was some connection with vampires and suicide at one point.
Oh, interesting.
I'd have to do more research. We'll talk about this. I think there is something. There's a vampire movie I want to talk about eventually.
That is so strange. I just thought there was some, alchemical thing with silver, and then
Yeah.
like werewolves are like, ooh, alchemy,
Yeah.
I don't know.
We don't like pseudoscience.
Yeah.
Scott McCall doesn't like pseudoscience.
I believe that. Oh, also that Italian guy, they put a burp joke in this movie for him, and I was like, I'm sorry, was this on Nickelodeon? This isn't funny.
So
like I don't mind like those kind of humor things. That was the only body humor in this movie, and it's a movie where like it doesn't really make sense in.
And there's like children getting kidnapped. So
yeah.
In horrific ways.
I taste good.
It's good.
Runs away.
We have the queen, who in the final act is dropped as being Thuringian, which shout out to that obscure principality. Thuringian representation, we need more. But she's this queen who's basically a version of the queen from Snow White, right? Mm-hmm. She's obsessed with being the fairest of them all, which is something Will references when he's doing a threesome with the twins.
Right before.
Right before. But she like needs to be beautiful. I think you're right, because I was like, why can't she have her evil umpire from her bed while she's like a zombie? But I guess she like wants to be able to walk around and like do things and also be hot.
Because the other thing is that because the whole thing is like she was vain. That's how she got her power, essentially.
Yeah.
Because she convinced people to bring her spells, and like
but then they say she like tortured people at one point. Yeah, there's a colonialism narrative which we will unpack after we stop discussing the queen. But
yeah, she was there for like 500 years. It's sort of like the situation with in Stardust. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but an excellent addition for this podcast. But the three witches, they kind of don't do anything until like they find out there's a star that's landed on Earth, because they're so like old and decrepit. There's nothing they can do.
Yeah.
So I think it's something like that, where like she just has to lay in her bed and wait for everything to line up. Like the thing is, like, she was there for 500 years. She had to wait for someone to wander into the forest, and that she could like
control.
Yeah, because she has to.
How did she control him though? How did she get control over him?
So basically, he was like out hunting or something, and he was frozen. He got lost in that forest.
Oh yeah.
She like sensually called to him. He found her. She made him warm, and then stuck that dagger thing that I'm assuming was controlling him.
Yeah.
And keeping him alive, because he dies. I'm pretty
without
sure.
it. Yeah.
And yeah, that's how she mind controls
him. But she had to wait 500 years. Okay. Oh, to get him, because I'm like, she just needed a blood moon, which happens often enough.
But she was waiting for someone to get those girls for her. Yeah. And that means no one went into that forest for like 500 years or whatever, until her dad passed away, like, I don't know, 10 years
until maybe people went in, but then the birds came and they were like, bite, like they didn't get close enough.
Or it's that folklore that like, they just believed of this story, and they just like stayed away from the forest.
Yeah.
But then there's literally that scene where she's like telling, like, oh, my dad told me the story, and then he's telling her the story in front of the tower. Yeah, so it doesn't really line up, but I think it's that like happenstance, because the folklore people are like, we're not going in there, but he ended up getting lost in there. Yeah. And it just, happenstance. The stars aligned for her.
Which eventually they do with that blood moon. Okay, so there's a colonialism narrative. I'll try and keep it brief. Germany was not considered part of France when Napoleon took it over. I'm not in a super, like, we're not going to spend a lot of time critiquing historical accuracy in these movies, obviously, because that's not the point. But like, so when Napoleon came in, he set up puppet states. They weren't just like, this is France now. But I do like this simpler setup, because it highlights like the liberté, égalité, fraternité, like post-Enlightenment, post-revolution France versus like these German superstitious peasants, mm-hmm. So that's interesting. But okay, so there's this colonialism, like religious narrative thing. So she talks about the Christian king, like he comes in and he cut down the trees and he's bad. So here's the thing. A lot of media does this in time periods where people wouldn't be so pagan versus Christian. Like they say, right, the Christian versus the pagan. At this point in time, the division would be Catholic or Protestant or atheist. And atheist was like new, mm-hmm. And so you could have done a different, like, people who we might now describe as pagan might be like kind of folk Christian or folk Catholic specifically, right, where it's like Christianity mixed with folk practices. And that was very common.
Which is probably what Angelica was.
Yeah. Like,
and like her whole village.
Yeah, and so there was the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, which kind of led to more like strict religious policies of what was allowed, what could be done. In the Counter-Reformation, like, we don't do unicorns in art anymore. Sorry, over. So like that there was like an attempt that was still happening this period to like root out that superstition, but still like superstitious people still identified as Christian. You
Right.
know, like they just melded those elements, especially in like those rural villages.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that happens at the very beginning of the movie. I'm pretty sure they have crosses
yeah,
at this village that they first start out at and do the fake,
yeah, exorcism
whatever.
thing. So also, though, in Germany there was a history of like Charlemagne and other German kings like being like baptized or you'll die kind of thing. Like Christianity was more politically enforced in that region of the world, as opposed to like in countries like France and Ireland, it was a more gradual conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was never a law in Ireland that was like you can't be pagan anymore, at least not for a while. It would just eventually everyone just slowly switched over.
Right.
And part of that was because they were allowed to keep a lot of their folk customs.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, I get where they're pulling from, but so there, I like, okay. Ugh, there's so much to talk about. So they say, okay, like they're implying that Christian King is evil for cutting down this forest and it grows back. And I think they're trying to say the forest is kind of like this morally gray entity. But
Mm.
in this story, the forest is evil,
Is evil. It's literally like
attacking
walking
people,
around, yeah,
eating
attacking
people.
people. Yeah. What happened to that one guy that just like got thrown up in the air? No idea what happened to
Yeah, it's
him.
kidnapping these girls. And I guess it's supposed to be under the influence of the queen, but like we don't
Right.
see what it's like outside of her influence. So that's an evil forest. Like, yeah, cut that down.
Yeah. Yeah, I did notice that too. Her saying that, and she kind of says that it's the English, right? Doesn't she? Or she say Christians?
Christians, yeah.
Okay, maybe that's what it was.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's so weird.
White people want to be suffering from colonialism so bad. So I like the idea though of like this Carlinian aesthetic and this like evil Christian witch. That's kind of
Mhm.
cool. But the plague timeline, okay, they say it arrived on her wedding day and then the king died. And I'm like, yeah, so apparently the succession laws, she's still queen. She can build this tower, which I guess she used magic to get food, and apparently she tortured people to get the spells. But like the timeline of like if everyone's dying from the plague from the moment she got married, how did she have time to amass all these spells while also being in this tower to avoid the plague, which is carried on the wind, so she like dies from it anyway?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like none of this is fully baked, you know.
Yeah.
Unlike Sasha, it's just like there's again, like we're mostly critiquing this from like a storytelling perspective at this point because like there are interesting concepts here that you can definitely play around with, but it feels overstuffed with a lot of half-baked things.
Yeah.
And it kind of I would have preferred if they hadn't focused so much on like the French stuff. Also, let's quickly talk about that weird dinner party they had with like the thousand mirrors. I hated that. Made
Oh
me so
yeah.
uncomfortable. But like I feel like there needs to be better connective tissue with the French stuff because otherwise I feel like it's not super necessary. Like I feel like it would be very natural for these guys to come across, this
Yeah.
mystery and be like, oh shit, this is real. We got to help them. That would have been a better brother to brother conflict. And so like the French pushing them into this, it's overstuffed.
Yeah, I think the French, the like the Napoleon, like the French versus German stuff is part of why they did the tales, and so that's
Yeah.
interesting. But I do think you're right, and that doesn't really add anything to this movie and like what this
Mm-mm.
movie's trying to do, because in this movie they're not doing the stories as a form of French resistance
And I also feel
or
like
resistance against the French. Yeah,
the way it is now, I feel like you have to have a lot of that context that you gave at the beginning of this episode to understand why the hell are the French in Germany,
yeah. I don't
Because
think
like
your
people,
average American or
I'm your
anywhere
average,
viewer,
maybe I'm slightly above average
but
with some of
like,
like the historical things I know, but like again, I was like, I vaguely understand what's going on, but also I don't think it needs to be in this movie.
yeah,
Because if they wanted to honor real life, they would have had to do it some other way,
yeah.
honor, quote unquote. But like,
Is this as egregious as the inclusion of the Brothers Grimm and Drew Barrymore's Ever After? No, but we'll get there.
yeah. Um, Again, I
Marie
think there's a
Therese went through enough. You don't need to drag Marie Antoinette's daughter into your Drew Barrymore movie. Okay, keep going.
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I don't know. Like, I didn't hate it. Like, you were like, I think you're gonna hate it. I mean, there are things I hate about it, like
Yeah.
Will, but like, I also think that was kind of like the character Matt Damon played in that era. It was just kind of like
Yeah.
a Playboy-esque.
Well, I think the whole point is he's supposed to grow, but he doesn't really.
He doesn't grow because he literally at the end of the movie, he's like, let's go find some girls. And it's like, you can't wait to wet your whistle for just like a little bit. You just defeated a queen. And I guess like all the hype from that, like you get really sexually aroused. But also like, okay, let's quickly go back to the queen. She was very sexual and like whispering. She like was nibbling on
Yeah.
Jake's ear. And I was like, I mean, this is hot, but like, I feel like there could have been something more interesting with that trope that they're clearly playing on, that like she's this enchantress.
Yeah.
And of course, like when she's doing that, you see her in the bed with her long ass fingernails puppeteering, and she's a decrepit zombie. So I don't know. It was just such a strange addition to have. Like, we saw the way she manipulates, but like I don't understand how that applies to Jake or Will's characters, really.
Yeah. They almost got Nicole Kidman from the AMC commercial to play her, but she wasn't available.
Yeah, because she's sitting in that theater that is very clearly overlit. That commercial. I'm just replaying it. And also,
I clap.
Like, it's just, I mean, I don't know. I think it's better than going on a roller coaster ride at Regal Cinemas. Last time I went to a Regal, they had Minions in that. And I was like, can't we just keep this the same?
Yeah, you're like, I don't need to see the people that destroyed the Holy Roman Empire on my screen. The people responsible for Heath Ledger's Joker.
Yeah, so this movie, wild.
Okay, also about the queen, at one point she does a little sexy tantrum thing when she's mad. She's like, oh, I'm like, I hit it. Sexy tantrum. I think that is my least favorite trope. I didn't know it, but I think I'm gonna say that now. We'll see if that changes. But right now, episode 1, I'm declaring least favorite trope, sexy tantrum.
I also like, I don't understand what she hopes to gain in this new world either, because she has been essentially dead for 500 years. And like what does the world look like when she is in power? There was a plague, but is that actually because of her, or is it just a coincidence?
Yeah, she was just sitting in that tower, combing her long hair, and people died.
What are the stakes if she, I mean, yes, she's going to kill all these girls essentially, but like, okay, so she gets powers, so what happens?
So like Napoleon just shoots her with a cannon, like,
yeah, she's a magic being, like of course, like she could magic her way out
does
of something.
Does she defeat
like,
Napoleon?
Oh, like this is the thing, is like we need to know the stakes of like, well, what happens if she becomes like leader of the world?
Like in Lord of the Rings, right? You know, like Sauron is this evil force with all these armies,
because he was in power before. We see what happens. We don't want to repeat that. She was in power, there was a plague. I don't have all the evidence to prove that it was her fault.
Yeah, I feel like she was in power.
I mean, the people she tortured, of course, that's her fault.
But like was she in power
some people
for
being tortured
years? Like,
yeah, I don't know.
People born during her reign didn't even graduate high school.
I think we should give her a chance to lead the world and see what happens.
Yeah.
You know,
she'll just do a sexy tantrum, and
but no, we can't have women being leaders because they're going to destroy the world, because periods. So
yeah. Okay, so I love the mirror thing with her, and I think the sets, they're cool, they're spooky, they're cool. Really cool. Like even the villages have this, like, it's not like historically accurate, right?
No,
but it feels like the world of the Brothers Grimm.
And I actually don't mind the fact that I very clearly see that we are on a set. You know, like this is very much like the woods. It's very much a set, but that kind of adds to the storybook feel. And I totally buy it. Like, I'm not bothered by it at all. I think they did a really interesting job with, I mean, the design of this movie is really interesting. Like, it's completely dingy from the second it starts until like the queen is dead and like it's all bright again, and it's really well done, I think, in terms of a design perspective. Yeah, no, I think the visual team, really brought this movie. I think that's the aesthetic a Brothers Grimm movie should have, especially this kind. I don't love a lot of the costumes.
I think especially I feel
Weird.
like Angelica's in this like weird amorphous sack. It's like we don't want to fully put her in pants, but she's gonna be in this little sack. Like it's giving when Ariel washed up on the beach.
And you know what? That sack isn't even like practical because she's a hunter. Like that's not
Yeah.
practical.
Yeah, it's just like I feel like her costumes were the worst, but in general, like, because there's a lot of times where they're running around in like weird undergarments, and it just, I don't know. Yeah, I didn't like the costumes. I didn't. Okay, they climb the tower and they're like, why are there 12? Oh, look, there are 12 coffins. I'm like, you could have counted that from the ground?
Yeah, no, like you literally, that would have been safer as
Yeah.
well. That was also, I was like, okay, what's his plan of getting up there? He wants to go in, right? Okay, so but why is he like walking around? Like, why isn't he like trying to find a way to get in? Not like,
Yeah.
oh, there's another coffin. Oh, another one, another one. Like, you could walk around the tower on the ground.
Yeah.
Friend.
So, okay, here are, the fairy tale references in this.
Okay.
Okay,
I wonder if I'll track them with
we have
you.
Jack and the Beanstalk,
Yeah.
right? Not a Grimm story, not even a German story. That is an English story. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Jack is a stock character from English fairy tales. He's not a German one.
Fascinating. Well, clearly these writers didn't do their research.
Yeah, no. I think someone said magic beans or whatever, and that seemed like a good idea, and they put it in the backstory, but it's not. It's not there. All right. And they keep bringing it up. I'm like, Okay, banshees. They reference banshees, very specifically an Irish thing.
Oh, I didn't even catch that one.
Yeah, he's like, she's screaming like a banshee. I'm like, very specifically Irish.
Yes.
They reference Godfather Death. That's a deep cut. That's a good reference. There's a few stories with Death as a character in the Brothers Grimm. They talk about an imp that they have to get his name, Rumpelstiltskin.
Oh, I was gonna say, clearly Game of Thrones. They wrote it.
Yeah. They reference the Frog King because they say something about kissing a prince and a frog turning into a prince. The Brothers Grimm story does not feature a kiss.
Oh, interesting.
She throws a frog against a wall. She's like, you're disgusting.
Way more logical.
And then he turns into a prince. There's Little Red Riding Hood, right? There's the girl in the red cape who gets kidnapped by the woods, and there's a wolf.
Literally, just has a Red Riding Cape is how he writes it down.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's not how this story is.
There's Hansel and Gretel who are just called Hans and Greta. And I'm like, they're doing the breadcrumb, like.
It's also a great way to get right into the effects. When Greta, when her scarf is taken, it's like dancing around in the water. Terrible effects.
That was bad.
So bad. It like just does not age well. Like it's so bad. Going back to vibes though, I was like, it has Sleepy Hollow vibes.
Yeah.
Like very dark and dingy, which I thought was a really good reference. Shout out to my boyfriend. So I wrote Plague, and then I was like, the Brothers Grimm wrote Exodus. Crazy.
There's a reference to Little Brother and Little Sister because they say the animals don't drink from the spring. So that's a fairy tale where if you drank from a spring, you turn into a certain animal.
Interesting.
There's a lot of Snow White, right? You have the constant fairest of them all. You have the magic mirror. She even says, like, mirror, mirror. She wants to be most beautiful. There's the sleeping girls. There's the old lady randomly offering them an apple at the door, and they're pushed away.
I thought she was gonna actually like play a part. She's just an old crone that walks around. I was
She's just saying cursed.
I was like, I thought she was gonna be like the person working with the queen or something, and she wasn't.
She actually went to the same college as the old crone from Princess Bride.
Yeah.
She mainly just exists to shout things at people. Which
I
would probably do if I was an old crone back in the day. Like, I don't have any grandkids to embarrass anymore. I'm gonna scream at people. So there's references to Sleeping Beauty, right? Like there's the sleeping, there's the kiss, which is kind of a Brothers Grimm invention, is the kiss and Sleeping Beauty. And we'll get there when we talk about Sleeping Beauty, but they add the kiss. And they reference Richard the Charming rescuing Briar Rose, the Sleeping Beauty, in like their lore. There's references to Cinderella, because like he's cleaning, he calls them Cinderellas when they're randomly cross-dressed and cleaning.
Was that a thing? Like, would that have been a word, like a thing that he could reference? at that
Cinderella
point.
was a French. The name Cinderella comes from the French Charles Perrault story, which was written in the 1600s.
Right. But would this Italian guy know that?
Well, there is an Italian Cinderella where she murders one of her stepmothers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because at first I was like, that's a weird reference for him. But then it's like, whatever,
I mean,
it's Cinderella.
Yeah, I mean, close enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's glass slippers, which are also specifically in the French story, because in the coffin they randomly get glass slippers.
Yeah, I was like, I mean, it does make it harder for them to run away.
And then they
get out.
they clink them during the spell, and I'm like,
I was like, they wrote the Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, Wizard of Oz reference. So a man is sucked into a tree at one point. Do you remember what he screams when he's sucked into that tree?
No.
Aschenputtel. You know what that is?
Uh-uh.
That is Cinderella in German. That just means little ash girl in German. So a man is sucked into a tree and screams little ash girl. Okay, there is a tree in the Brothers Grimm Cinderella. There's a magic tree that helps her, but no reason to scream Aschenputtel, which ties into the Rapunzel references, right? There's the tower.
Yes.
Yeah, that's Rapunzel.
Long hair.
The long hair, but he flies down on the long hair and
rips it out of her skull.
Yeah. Which is, oh boy. And then he screams Rapunzel, which is just lettuce in German. So he's just being like, lettuce, as he falls from the tower. Like, it makes no sense. Like, even in the context of Rapunzel being a story, why would you just scream Rapunzel?
No, these references, I honestly feel like the person who wrote the spec script probably had like a solid thing going. And then all these like Hollywood people are like, reference, throw it at the wall, throw it at the wall, throw it at the wall.
Yeah. There's a girl named Elsie. There's a Brothers Grimm story called Clever Elsie or Clever Elsa, which I did for my high school speech competition. And really the whole point of the story is once upon a time there was a girl who everyone said was smart, but she was really dumb, and then she was really dumb in the end. Like, that's the short version. And so they said there's no moral, so then I just did Cinderella because there was a moral to that one. But and I killed it. I did a lot of different voices. I did the birds, I did the horse trotting. Yeah. But anyways, so there's a girl who's creepy with the horse. She's Clever Elsie, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a gingerbread man reference, which comes from an American story, which has European roots.
Shrek.
Shrek,
yeah,
yes.
I'm familiar with that one.
the text. But there's a German version about like Johnny Pancake or something. So the story of food running away is like an old story. It just isn't really in the Brothers Grimm. I thought there was going to be a reference to the water nixie, which is a kind of water spirit that would kidnap young boys, in sometimes girls in the well, and that there are Brothers Grimm stories about that. But
is that what the mud monster is?
Maybe. I think this movie is guilty of nymph erasure. First movie, first crime of nymph erasure. They almost could have referenced a nymph, but they didn't. And we will talk about nymph erasure in a property that it's more relevant to, but it is one of my strong passions in fantasy media is the erasure of nymphs. So guilty.
Another one that I found, there's 2 times that someone pricks their finger. One of them is on a rose.
Sleeping Beauty.
Yes, I thought that was kind of I was like, I caught that one.
And there's she's on on multiple mattresses. So I'm like, is that
Princess and the Pea?
Hans Christian Andersen, a literary fairy tale.
Yes, I was gonna say, I was like, I don't think that. I was like, that doesn't sound like one that they would do. I don't know what told me that, but like, I was like, Princess and the Pea, and then I was like, that doesn't seem right, but I get that reference.
Something about a princess just being naturally so delicate is just too like cutesy for the Brothers Grimm, and they weren't monarchist enough. They weren't like anti-monarchist, but they were very just like Protestant middle class. That's not their thing. They often came into conflicts with royalty. Sometimes they got along, but other times they did come into conflict. So those are the references. So that's kind of the fantasy aesthetic of the film. So now it's the key question. Hannah, was that your fantasy?
So I had a preliminary answer written down before I watched it. I said, probably not. I think I probably hated this movie when I saw it as a youth. Maybe it's because the movie just wasn't good or I just didn't understand it. And actually I came away with, I actually wanted this idea to work. because again, there's so many things that could work about it.
Yeah, it's a really good idea.
Like you said, that initial premise, like as a log line, really good. Even if it wasn't the Brothers Grimm, like, but with the Brothers Grimm involved, it makes it, more interesting.
Yeah.
I think they could have done better to play with the Brothers Grimm stuff instead of just throw fairy tale references in there. But yeah, I mean, I wanted it to work, but it just didn't. And like that whole like middle 70 hours of the movie was so slow and like nothing was really happening. And they had all these gadgets and they didn't really end up using any of the gadgets, which kind of bummed me out. I kind of thought like, oh, it'd be cool if one of these gadgets actually works.
Yeah, if they're like ghost hunters.
With the exception of like with the exception of the like the grappling hook thing. But that's like a thing. It's not like a gadget that they had a catapult and they had that weird scientific headset that, wasn't gonna work, but does definitely remind me of something that Ghost Adventures would try out. But Cullen, was it your fantasy?
I love the Brothers Grimm and I kind of love this world that they made, but it was not my fantasy because I think I get the idea, I get the premise. I think it would have been better if they had actual fairy tale characters instead of just illusions. I think I get why they went this route. And now that we've explored it with this route, we know it didn't work,
Yeah.
Because literally I watched this movie and I'm like, I already have like too many stories based on fairy tales, like as a writer, but I'm like, okay, like Brothers Grimm, kind of like like a Netflix series, like, a 10-episode series, like with multiple seasons, of course, but like where they're like in this town, like you can do their like teenagers and they're like interacting with these fairy tale characters. Some of the stories have happened in the past, some are happening now, like, and they don't happen exactly as the stories go. And sometimes it's just references. You could do a lot with that, and that would be interesting. And then it's kind of like they wrote stories based on their experiences early in life,
Which I have gotten confirmed now from this podcast is that they in real life did not experience these creatures and stories.
No.
Pretty bummed about that.
Pretty bummed.
But,
They did not turn into a deer by drinking water and then be carried around by their sister by a little leash, like in Little Brother and Little Sister. I like the idea, but yeah, it was not my fantasy. I think the premise is good, but the execution was poor.
Yeah.
What did we learn today as, budding amateur folklorists?
I mean, I learned a lot about Brothers Grimm in general. I didn't know anything about them, and I can't even tell you if I've ever actually read one of their stories. Like I think I probably have, but because I was, I also had the Disney picture storybook, like the big blue book. I was
that's the one I wanted to buy, and my mom was like, "You're gonna buy the Brothers Grimm."
You know what? I think your mom had a really good point that like the Disney stories are fun, but I think there's probably more substance, more interesting stuff to chew on in some of those Grimm fairy tales because it's not what you're seeing in the movies. It's just something different,
Yeah.
It's not just like they're better. It's just like it's different than what we see in mainstream media. And again, I learned that these creatures are not real. Not in the past. Allegedly, yes.
Allegedly. So yeah, that's a thing. Just one little soapbox as we leave is that one of the reasons I want to do this podcast and talk about the source material for a lot of these movies is that, I believe that folklore and this stuff, it belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to institutions and corporations. And now it's become these IPs that corporations buy and sell, and they sell to us. But we made this stuff up. The corporations didn't. We, the people, invented these corporations. Well, also we did invent corporations.
We did that too.
Unfortunately. Sorry. That's one of those Eve mistakes. But like these like too bad
we bit the apple and Disney happened.
Yeah. World history summarized. But like we created these stories. They come from our beliefs and our folk beliefs, and like we have the right to own them and change them and examine them. And a lot of public domain laws have changed, especially because of Disney itself and other corporations trying to control these IPs
when they're not IPs, because intellectual property kind of assumes that it's the work of one person or a collective group.
Yeah.
When, like we said, like there are multiple versions of Cinderella and all these other stories that like they're just kind of cobbling together.
Yeah.
So it's
like they shouldn't.
It's actually open source.
Yeah, they shouldn't act like they own. Like I think at one point they tried to trademark the name Princess Aurora, which they took from the Tchaikovsky ballet. You know, like they're so. Yeah, Amazon paid all this money for Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings came from one man, but he's also dead, and he also built a lot off of folklore, which was his intention. That's not like he was ripping things off, but like
right.
I think these ideas and these concepts, should belong to the people to build on and to tell our own stories, whether we're making money off of them or not, whether they're just whether we're aspiring writers or we're just telling stories to our friends and our children. I think the Brothers Grimm, by collecting these stories, yes, they made money off them, but they also were trying to give a voice to a nation, but through its folklore. And I think there's value in that. And that's why I wanted to start with them. Because that's kind of the ethos of this podcast, is like remembering that these stories come from us and not from Walt Disney and Peter Jackson and Andrew Adamson, the director of Shrek. Who are, I have a lot of affection for these men. I used to really love Walt Disney, and then, you grow up and things happen. So like, I don't want to just be like, yeah, love all these people, but like,
grow up, you find out about Walt Disney.
And you're like, but then you're like, you know what, that tracks. But, just like, you can still appreciate these movies, and I really do. I love them, but like, well, not necessarily this one, but, the genre, but like also acknowledging that they're not a corporations, they're ours. Speaking of Disney, our next episode number 2, is kind of a Halloween season special. We will be talking about one of Disney's spookiest animated films, The Black Cauldron.
I have never seen it, I don't think.
I really enjoyed this movie growing up. It is based on Welsh folklore.
Oh.
But specifically,
Ancestry tells me that I'm Welsh. And I also know that I'm part Welsh.
Maybe you'll really connect with Taryn and Ilonwe then, yeah. And I think, though I should clarify, they're based off books based off of Welsh folklore.
Cool.
Yeah. So you can follow us on Instagram and TikTok on Not My Fantasy Pod.
You want to watch us on YouTube if you want to see our faces?
Oh yeah,
we'll be there.
We're gonna be on YouTube.
We didn't do that for Glee Boot. Also, I mean, I guess like we should shout out Glee Boot. Like, if you're listening to this many years in the future, or if you're literally listening to this as it comes out, and Glee Boot is still technically a thing, you can also find us Glee Boot, GLEEBOOT. We talk about Glee. If that's something you're interested in, you should check out that podcast too.
Yeah, and even if you are listening to it years later, it will probably be on the internet forever. So.
Yep. And you know what? Maybe one day I'll come to regret that. But right now, I'm very proud of what we've done. And, I should get an award from Ryan Murphy himself.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
And you know what? I should get an award from Matt Damon for watching this movie too. And also for it like not being as good as it could have been. He owes me. He
does, specifically. So thank you for listening to our first episode.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed it. First episodes can be hard to do. So please send us your feedback. Don't send us hate, but we do take constructive criticism. And also if you really enjoyed it, let us know. Let us know the things you want us to talk about.
Yeah.
Especially like as we kind of announce things that we're gonna be talking about. Like be like, hey, like have you heard of the controversy surrounding Egyptian representation in this subreddit? Like whatever weird thing that you find interesting, send us a link and we might include it in our discussion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously like first couple episodes, they're gonna be a little chaotic as we figure it out, but yeah, feedback is always appreciated. Just, always remember that this is a new podcast. We're trying to figure it out and make it awesome. But yeah, we definitely want to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, we're excited for you to join us on our hero's journey discovering this podcast.
That was the original title of the podcast.
Yeah, that was our working title.
Aww.
Then we got sassy. Yeah. Typical Cullen and Hannah.
That's us.
All right, tune in next week. Bye.
Bye.
Are we always gonna do the bye?
Maybe not. Just say bye.
Bye.